Okay, y'all, I have 6:30, so we'll go ahead and get started this evening. Want to welcome everybody. I know last week kind of threw everybody for a loop, and that's probably why we don't have a lot of people on tonight. But I didn't want to lose our momentum and kind of get this one out of the way before we got into the end of the month and November, doing a lot of Appalachian type folklore, kitchen gardens, holiday traditions, and all of that good stuff. So I will kind of preface by letting you know that wildcrafting is something that we typically try to do a little bit more of in the spring, where we can get out and actually walk with folks and actually do some hands-on foraging. But the purpose for tonight is to just kind of introduce you to this practice. This is kind of a little unusual, I guess, for extension. When we talk about extension classes, we don't usually talk about some of these non-research based type practices. But this is something like with all my other classes, I try to present to you in a way with a lot of historical background and kind of how we know the things we know. And we know that we're kind of starting to come full circle with a lot of these plants, and we're slowly starting to ease into that realm in regards to research within the land grant system. So with that, we'll just go ahead and jump in. And as always, feel free to put those questions or comments, anything that I'm talking about as we move through, into the chat box. I can't see those on my end when they pop up, so I'll try to get those answered and sent to y'all in an email with a copy of the presentation a little bit later. But just to kind of open us up to wildcrafting, and you notice there that I did change the title because it was, I think, wild foraging or foraging for wild edibles or something like that. But wildcrafting is often the term that we use here in the Southern Appalachians. So we know that wildness within us never truly goes away. We're guests on the planet, and while we may have built cities, the cycles of nature that have existed far before us in time will continue on long after we are gone. And I think that's a great quote to kind of set the framework for tonight's journey. So when we do think about essentials in wildcrafting, of course, we're going to be in the wilderness, walking in the forest and that kind of thing, although several of us are probably doing a lot of this at home. Y'all probably know that I do a lot of this just in my own backyard because I've deliberately created that kind of environment. But if we take to the real wilderness, a couple of things we need to carry with us, and those are common sense. We need to make sure that we're smart and that we're utilizing all of our senses. And I'll explain some of that as we move through this evening. We want to have a passion for what we're doing. We need to have that keen desire to utilize these plants. And basically that's connecting with the natural world, and then be ethical in what we're doing, making sure that we're doing it right and being responsible, taking care of Mother Earth so we can continue populations and colonies of these plants long after we are all gone. So for tonight, just a few things that we're going to kind of tap into. We're going to talk about what wildcrafting is. We're going to talk about safety, how to explore. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the materials that we use when we're wildcrafting or foraging, and then ethics, just how to be responsible when we're doing that. So we'll start out with wildcrafting, what it is. And of course, we know that's the age-old practice of gathering herbs and plants from wild, natural growth locations. Pretty simple definition. It's things that our ancestors have been doing for years. It's things that indigenous tribes here were doing long before folks started coming across the big pond. We know being outside in nature, it inspires feelings of awe and wonder and acquaints us with our higher self. And basically what that is saying is that it's all about connection. When we go to wildcrafting and wild foraging, that's just an educational experience. It's a growth for all of us because we're basically tapping into ourselves and getting in tune with nature. And it's basically just being cognizant of the symbiotic relationships that occur within the natural environment and how to utilize those best for ourselves in an ethical way. So pretty simple definition, but as we start into wildcrafting, it's all about being safe. Notice there in every sense of the word, and we're going to explore quite a bit of that here in the next few slides. When we do take to wildcrafting, a few things here pretty simple, what to do and what not to do. If you're starting into wildcrafting, ease into it slowly if you're a newbie, and we're going to talk a lot about that in a few minutes. Remember that practice makes perfect, but we don't want to be out here foraging wild plants that are going to be toxic or cause any kind of bad reaction to us or other people that we might be feeding these edibles to or anything like that. What not to do is to be a know-it-all. Just remember that it takes a lot of time to be proficient, no matter how long all of us may have been doing this. Experience really does make us wise, and sometimes we learn those hard lessons. And it's through some of those hard lessons that knowledge has been passed down through the generations over time. So we'll kind of go through a few step-by-steps and talk about each one of these a little bit more. Like I say, step one, we want to go slow because this is not what we want to end up doing. We want to make sure that we know if we have allergies or any kind of reaction. That can occur in the wild, just like it can with any kind of conventional food that we put into our bodies. And maybe it's just me, but it seems like there's a higher case of allergens in today's world. It seems like I hear that so much more today than when I was in school. You know, peanut allergies, mushroom allergies, all kinds of things. We have to be really careful about those things, but kind of going slow and experiment with one plant at a time to be able to know what that tolerance level is really going to behoove us to have a long-term sustainable relationship with the natural world. Step two is just talking to local experts. And these experts could have a cumulative amount of experience like you see here in the field, or it could be an individual person that has had years of experience wandering the woods and harvesting for years and years. If you don't have access to a local expert, making sure that you're using sound resources, websites, books, and I know I tend to be old school when it comes to resources with Google so prevalent these days, but I really do prefer hardback books because little books like this, you see it kind of fits in the palm of my hand. I can slip those right into a backpack as I'm out foraging, or even these little trifolds. I don't know if you can see that very well, but they make it really handy to be able to identify. Plus they're water repellent when you're out in the woods. But anyway, just consulting multiple sources before you get started. And you'll see what I'm talking about that the more we move through. Step three there, don't eat it just because. Maybe you've heard other people talking about eating these mushrooms that they're foraging from the wild or any kind of plant. Just because somebody says it's okay to eat doesn't necessarily mean that it is, because hidden within these mushrooms might be a couple that are not safe for us to eat and can cause us to really trip out, for lack of a better term. So always try a little bit to start with, and like I said, do one plant at a time so you'll know how you're going to react. Step four is just knowing your environment, and this is kind of where it gets tricky, because here in Northeast Tennessee, our environment is going to be a little bit different from what it is in West Tennessee. We're going to have different plants that are going to be native to the local area. We're going to have different plant relationships that are going to exist within different habitats. Climate can affect a lot of these plants. We may have plants here that are over harvested, or vice versa in other regions of the state or other regions here in the United States. So another thing about this is that we want to make sure when we are wild harvesting, we know where that plant is growing. If it's growing in a wet area, for instance, we want to know where that water source is, because what if that water has been contaminated and we might be wild harvesting something and eating that raw, then we're putting that into our system, into our body. So we just need to make sure that we know anything that might have been sprayed, like I say, right-of-ways or roadways. Oftentimes heavy-duty chemicals are going to be utilized in those circumstances to clear those. Garlon herbicide, for instance, that's definitely something we don't want to be ingesting. We need to be able to know what plants are. This is probably one that many of you, I hope, recognized, and you wouldn't want to be wild harvesting this one, because otherwise you're going to be wild harvesting for something else to cure this ailment, which this is poison ivy. So it's just kind of about, knowing the environment, and there's so many things that are going to influence that over time. Step 5, pretty simple. That's utilizing all of your senses. And what do we mean by that? When you're wild foraging, look for patterns. You know, what color is the plant? What does it feel like? Are the leaves rough? Are they smooth? Are they fuzzy? All of these are going to be clues, or those little nods from Mother Nature that are kind of telling us what we can and cannot use. Think about what it smells like or even tastes like. So for instance, if it smells like a mint and it looks like a mint because it has that square stem, then more than likely that's going to be a safe plant to use. Same way with onions, any of our wild garlic or onion species. If it smells like that onion, really stout smell, we all know what that smells like, then it's going to be safe for us to eat. If it looks like an onion and it doesn't have that really highly fragrant aroma, then that's probably something we want to steer clear of. So again, Mother Nature is just going to kind of give us some clues. Even a particular sound, any of those type things are going to kind of tell us if that plant is safe to harvest. We want to make sure that we're identifying these plants correctly. And I don't know what happened to my picture. So let me see if it's over here. And no, it's not. So I guess I'll just stop in this. But if you've got a plant that you think you know what it is, double check to make sure, because if you have even the slight inclination that, well, you know, I'm not really sure if that's Queen Anne's lace, you know, that's when you don't really want to take, you know, a lot of, I mean, you just want to be absolutely certain, because what if that is actually poison hemlock or water hemlock? You know, that's what we don't want to get into, because that's very toxic, even though they look very similar. So just make sure that we know what plant that we're harvesting. Think about if it has white sap. If it has a white sap like this is a milkweed, then that's probably one we want to steer clear of. That's not to say that our monarch butterflies don't love this. It's not to say that our Native American ancestors and early settlers didn't utilize this plant, but it can actually be quite poisonous when it's ingested. So we have to be very careful with that. Same thing with white berries. White berries can be really pretty, but kind of Mother Nature is telling us right here, whoa, with the red stem, back off. Anything that has a white berry is going to be toxic for us to ingest. So if you have kids or grandchildren, this is probably one you don't want to be planting in your landscape either. But this is the white baneberry, or what we call doll's eyes. And you'll often see this in this shape right now, this time of year. You'll actually see those doll's eyes protrusion. But this is one we don't want to be handling, very toxic. Step 9 there is be humble with umbels. That's a mouthful. So I kind of used this example a few minutes ago between identification. And again, Mother Nature is always going to kind of let us know what plants are safe and what are not, which is not. But you can kind of tell by looking at these pictures, they look very similar. And if we're looking at these from a distance, it's going to be very, very hard to differentiate. So one way to kind of maybe relate that is Queen Anne's lace will always have that little drop of Queen Anne's blood in the center of the umbel there, because as the story goes, she was knitting or crocheting or something and pricked her finger with the needle, and hence that drop of blood spilled out on her doily. So we know when Queen Anne's lace is marked with this, or a plant is marked with this, then we know that that's going to be safe. Whereas our poison hemlock here on the left, which is what killed Socrates, he drank the juice of the poison hemlock, then we know that that's really bad for us to consume. The bad thing is, in nature, we have a lot of plants that are going to be very similar like this. That's why, again, positive ID is so critical. It's why it's so critical to make sure that we're researching and utilizing resources, finding a mentor, going with groups into the forest when you first begin wildcrafting yourself. And then mushrooms or shroom. And we've all heard that quote, tripping on shrooms. You know, we know a lot of these shrooms have hallucinatory effects, and some people might like that. I myself, I don't want to go down that road. I kind of like being in control too much, I guess. But we see lots of mushrooms. We're going to talk about mushrooms in a couple of weeks. That'll be one of the PowerPoints I'll be sending you. But this is one, when we see this in the wild, we think, wow, that's a pretty cool looking mushroom. But this is actually a very toxic mushroom. It's not one that we want to eat. One that I didn't put in here are the morel mushrooms, or the dryland fish. We know that's a really popular Appalachian staple in early spring. But there's also a mushroom that we call the false morel mushroom, and it looks very, very similar to a true morel mushroom. And again, it goes back to that proper accurate ID, because if we were to harvest the false morel mushrooms, then we're going to be a little bit sick after eating a tub full of those. And if you're like me, you eat a lot of the mushrooms all in one sitting. So we want to make sure we're harvesting the right ones. Number 11 there, if it's oniony, and I kind of already alluded to this, if it looks like an onion, tastes like an onion, smells like an onion, then you're going to be okay to consume that in the wild. Same thing with our mustards. Know that all mustards are going to be edible. You know, we have a lot of hybrid cultivars, a lot of different species of mustards, but mustards have been around for a very, very long time. This is going to be one of the forefather plants to all of our everyday cold crops like broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts and all that good stuff. So any of your mustards are going to be edible. Again, mints, I've kind of already alluded to that. This is our native mountain mint, the Picanthamum muticum, pretty sacred plant to our Native Americans and what we call the granny women practicing folk magic here in the Southern Appalachians. This is one that is held in pretty high regard. But again, if it smells like mint, tastes like mint, has that square stem, then it's going to be safe to utilize that. Pay attention if animals are eating those plants, because this is a kicker. We think, well, if deer or squirrel or birds can eat all of these goodies, bears, whatever that might be, raccoons, then surely it's safe for us to consume as well. And that is not the case at all. Don't copy the animals, especially in the case of birds. They're going to have a totally different digestive system to where they can actually utilize some of those toxic berries that we ourselves cannot handle. Bittersweet is one. The berry of bittersweet is very toxic to humans. Remember that experience always trumps theory. And what I mean by that again is just, again, practice makes perfect. You know, it takes many walks through the woods to be able to properly identify a lot of these plants. Something as simple as even ginseng. We have what we call false ginseng. We have plants that are going to look like ginseng. A lot of these are going to look alike. So just remember that it's not something you're going to go out on your first wildcrafting experience and be 100% on. But the critical thing is to always be as safe as possible. So when we do start into wildcrafting, just like with any other craft, we're going to require a few tools to make it a little bit easier on ourselves. So lots of information in these next few slides. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail, but I want you to know that in each one of these slides, there are links to different kinds of each one of these tools that I'm going to be talking about, because you might be in the, you might be in need of a new set of Velcro pruners or a hori-hori knife. That might be something you've never even heard of. So if you're curious about all that, there are several links, like I say, embedded in these slides. So some of my favorite tools of the trade would be the Velcro pruners. You can just strap those on your hip like you see here, and they'll pretty well cut through anything. Pretty sturdy pruners there. The hori-hori knife is really cool. It's heavy duty, but it's compact. It's not going to require a lot of room. You're going to be able to dig in the dirt. It's something that you can utilize for lifting roots. Well, you're going to be able to use that for a multitude of different things, even shearing the bark off trees. So any number of uses for a hori-hori knife. A digging fork, this is a pretty big one. We can use a smaller one, whatever we might be wildcrafting for. Excuse me. But primarily a fork, anything that's going to have those tines is going to help us more easily remove any kind of tuber or root without disturbing oftentimes the entire plant. And we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. A couple more are shovels. This is one you never want to leave home without. You see a big shovel picture there. It kind of depends on what you're going after, but even the little garden spade would suffice as well. Scissors are going to be the go-to tool. Always need to have a pair of scissors on hand. and then pruning saw. And these are really handy because I don't know if you can tell this, but it actually folds into, and there are many different sizes, but I call it my mini chainsaw. So again, pretty compact tool, easy to have on hand, requires minimal, being able to, just, it doesn't get dull. It's just a really good tool to have. Knives, any number of knives would do. Just a regular old pocket knife would often work. And as far as being able to collect any of your plants in baskets, those are pretty cheap. Even those bushel baskets we buy peaches in or blueberries in, anything like that would work. Or what we call the tub trugs, or a 5-gallon bucket. I don't have that pictured here. These tub trugs are a little bit more expensive, but they'll typically last a little bit longer. And you can kind of see there from that green one, you can smush it all up, and it takes up less space, and really easy to handle with. Gloves are usually a necessary item. I kind of put that one in there for myself because I always forget my gloves, and then I end up in a bunch of briars or thorns or thistles, and then there I am, and then I'm always digging stuff out of my fingers later. But chopping knife, this one here that you see is a mezzaluna knife. It's really good at fine chopping like you see here, but it's also great for cutting through roots or chopping up any kind of root that you're harvesting. And then a hand lens. Last but not least, this is a really good one to have to be able to get up close and personal botanically. And you kind of see there that she has a resource book. Of course, that's a dandelion. That's pretty self-explanatory. But when we're going through some of these books like this, there's going to be some close-ups. It's going to tell us a little bit more botanically what we're looking for. And a hand lens is often going to be that tool of choice that's going to help us more so than anything else. So very inexpensive to nab one of those online, about $5, pretty cheap. Then we come to ethics. And when we talk about wildcrafting, personally, I feel like this is probably the most important, because if you, and I think most of you have attended my classes before, you know that I'm really big on this. I think it's about making sure that we sustain Mother Earth so she can sustain future generations. And I think being ethical in our harvesting, even conventional harvesting in our garden, you've heard me talk about that before. And that's just my personal opinion, but I think back to our Native Americans that were here and our early settler ancestors that were here, and they always tried to take care of Mother Earth, because at the end of the day, they always knew that if they did that, then she too would take care of them. So that's kind of how I approach this. And you see there, following the code ensures adequate supply for generations to come. And I like this quote here: you never take more than you can use to survive on Mother Earth. You always respect the plants, because without them, we wouldn't be here. And you always give back. So when we harvest these plants, we develop relationships with them. And that kind of brings us to stewardship versus over harvesting. Because if you keep up with this kind of thing, then I was just referring to ginseng a few minutes ago. We know that a lot of these wild plants have been over harvested, they've been poached, and we know that some of these plants are big money makers, but as a result of the over harvesting, we've really reduced our colonies of many of these special plants. And taking too much, of course, that's going to be detrimental, and that's really going to result in a loss of species. And some of that can't be reversed. So we need to be very cognizant of that when we're wildcrafting or wild foraging. So that's where stewardship comes in. We want to make sure that we're ensuring continued vitality and sustainability of the ecosystem, whatever ecosystem is that we are wild harvesting from. So just a few tips on these, and we'll go through each one of these, but I have no idea what those little Saturn things are, but we'll just skip through that, okay? And we'll talk about cultivate. So a lot of people would probably look at you like you're crazy if you talk about having a relationship with plants or cultivating that relationship with plants, just getting to know them botanically and connecting on their level. Because just think about all of us sitting here on the Zoom, how can we understand one another if we don't get to know our stories, right? That's how we build a relationship. So it's that way in the plant world too. Listening to kind of what that plant has to say. I just did a talk Saturday at our Healthy Harvest Field Day and talked about woodland medicinals and edibles. And, that was one of the things I was talking about was that doctrine of signatures. I think some of you might have heard me talk about that a few weeks ago, but, just understanding that Mother Nature gives us this little set of winks and nods and pretty much tells us that these plants are here for you to use, for whatever ails you, and they're here to help you. So that's kind of basically what that means. It's just kind of cultivating that relationship, and it goes back to what we've already been talking about, properly identifying that plant, researching that plant thoroughly, knowing what that plant is going to do for you as an edible or as a medicinal, knowing if that plant has any toxic properties, because as we start moving more into wildcrafting, you'll find that there are going to be plants that are 100% toxic, all parts of that plant. And you're going to find plants that all parts are 100% edible or medicinal in their use. But then we have this middle ground where we've got parts of the plant that are going to be very toxic to us to consume, but then parts of that same plant are going to be good for us to use. And oftentimes it will be a seasonal type thing. So it's about, again, creating that relationship with that plant, being very in tune with its life cycle and how it grows, and knowing it botanically to know how it's going to affect us and how we're going to use that. Research is going to be very critical, just realizing that every ecosystem is going to vary. Research impacts you may have on plant populations and spiritual connections to our indigenous tribes. So there's still a lot of that goes on, sacred ground, if you will, being mindful of that, especially in national parks, national forest, any steward of the land, prior to us, being respectful of that. And when you're not a wild harvester, sometimes that philosophy doesn't always click. But when you're actually out there involved with Mother Nature herself and kind of connecting, you kind of realize that that's really important before starting a harvest and utilizing some of these plants. Asking permission, and this could be asking the plant for permission to harvest. Believe it or not, this still goes on. And again, a lot of people would probably look and be like, what in the world is that person doing? But this goes back to, you can see here a Cherokee prayer. It goes back to our indigenous tribes and even our early ancestors. They would do that. You'll hear me talk in a few weeks. Some of you may remember from last year when I talked about the fairy folk from the old world, or the little people with the Cherokee. They paid homage to that, and that belief system is still in place. So it's asking that plant for permission and returning the favor, and always saying thank you by leaving a gift. Back in the day, it used to be cornmeal or piece of biscuit or tobacco. Even, something as simple as watering the plant or scattering seeds, something like that, when you take from Mother Nature, returning the favor. Permission also means being personally responsible if you are going to forage on personal property, personal land. Don't be off in your neighbor's woods without them knowing about it. Make sure that you're following proper protocol. We hear those stories all the time, especially we'll go back to ginseng or ramps or the mushrooms or cohosh, some of those highly sought after medicinal herbs. And we know that people are not always asking permission to dig. So making sure that we obtain that before wildcrafting is very paramount. Knowing the rules, just again, remember no trespassing on private land. Know the rules on public lands. That should be K-N-O-W instead of N-O. Sorry about that. I'll correct that before I send this out to y'all. But know that if you are going to collect in national parks or forest service lands or anything like that, this is a snippet here, collection permits that I took right off the website. And there's a link on this page for you to peruse. But for about $20, you can get a permit to be able to obtain some of these wildcrafted plants from land other than your own. There's a lot to kind of sift through, so this is just a snippet of that. So if it's something you're interested in doing, make sure that you review that, and you can kind of see there those forms are highlighted on the website. So it's just a matter of clicking on those and completing those and paying and getting a permit to do that. Again, you've heard me mention this several times, but protecting those at-risk species. So when we start into wildcrafting and we're doing our research, then we're going to recognize a few. I've got 4 of those listed here that are going to be at risk. We know ginseng, always touted for being a mood booster and an energy enhancer. Arnica is a natural painkiller and anti-inflammatory superstar. We know that ramps are considered one of those early spring tonics, and then golden seal, just a multitude of healing benefits for that plant. So all these plants have been sought after for so long, especially this root right here, the ginseng, after it dries out. But we got to be very cautious in how we wildcraft these. As far as foraging for beginners, and that's kind of where I approached this from, because I wasn't sure where everybody's skill level was at. But I know when, I guess maybe I kind of first started into this, you realize that, well, I guess I've been wild foraging pretty much my whole life and just didn't even really know the term for it, or didn't realize the relationship or whatever. It's kind of connecting those dots. So maybe for some of you might find some of these plants a little bit new that you can actually have a different use for. But as far as foraging, I pulled out about, I don't know, 10 to 12 plants to kind of maybe get you started. And of course, chickweed, that's going to be one of those winter annuals that start germinating around Thanksgiving. It does have weed in the name, and a lot of folks don't like it as a weed, or don't like it as a plant grown in their yard, and they want to eradicate it with herbicide. But if you like pesto, it really is a great weed to utilize in pesto. Violets are going to be emerging at the same time in the spring, and if high cholesterol is an issue, this one is going to mimic oatmeal. It's nature's oatmeal, and it's very tasty. It's also used pretty frequently as a thickener in a lot of different baked goods. Plus, you're getting a lot of that cholesterol benefit as well. Dandelions, I talk about this one all the time. It is a bitter, which means it's going to stimulate digestion. All parts of this plant are going to be edible. This is one that we can use pretty much on a day-to-day basis in some form or fashion. It's one that we can actually preserve and be able to use it throughout the season, even when it's not actively growing. So you can use it in a syrup or a wine, jams or jellies. You can dry the flowers, use those in baked goods. A lot of good uses for dandelions. Same way with nettles. This is one that's going to grow in a swampy area. This is one that you want to be careful if you're wildcrafting for. When I was talking about the environment earlier, know that water source. Because if it were contaminated, then that's something you're going to be drawing into your body as well, because nettles, as you see there, are a very good supreme blood builder, and they will add a lot of iron to your diet, but they will also hold a lot of toxins. So that's why knowing that environment is so critical. Brambles, we all know that they're antioxidant superpowers. Raspberries and blackberries, the fruit themselves just chock full of antioxidants, but don't forget the leaves, especially raspberry leaves. Very highly nutritious, can be ground up and made into a tea. A lot of vitamin C in the raspberry leaf. And then burdock, this one is what I refer to as the bloat blaster. You've heard me talk about that in other classes. The cool thing about this one is that you can be digging it right now. It's got a really long and strong, extensive taproot. So you can cut those roots up and utilize those like a tuber. Pretty tasty, even have a citrusy-like taste, believe it or not. You can chop that root up and actually cook it down in water and strain off the root and then drink that as the bloat blaster. So lots of good uses for the burdock, but harvesting at the proper time is going to be critical. Right now, as it's starting to die back for winter, the roots are going to be chock full of nutrients, but they're going to be possess a lot more oomph if you will. They're going to have a stronger taste than what they would if you dig those in early spring. So it kind of depends on your personal flavor profile. Some others are going to be roses. Believe it or not, rose hips are higher in vitamin C than any other plant. So lots of good ways to be able to use rose hips, of course, in teas or any kind of beverages, even butters, lots of cool things to do with those. Plus you can eat the rose petals. You can candy those or sugar those and make them into candy. Black walnuts, these are pretty prevalent right now, akin to the English walnut, but these have a very strong, highly, bitter tasting, I don't know how you would describe the flavor of black walnuts. If you've never had them, you should try them. They're just very unique. But walnuts, I guess the biggest thing there is when you're working with walnuts to make sure that you have on gloves. As you can tell there from the nut, it will yield a brown dye, and that dye will linger for quite some time. So be very careful with that. But lots of different uses for the walnuts. You can chop the nuts up and just use them, of course, but you can grind them into a flour. But it's very good for cleansing the digestive tract. That's what it's touted for more than anything else. The chestnut here that I'm referring to is the Chinese chestnut, the little burry pod with the chestnuts that are dropping this time of year. The cool thing about the chestnuts is compared to any other nut, these are going to have more starch than fat. So we know that we hear our medical doctors telling us all the time, eat more nuts. They would probably frown on the chestnut because of that high carbohydrate content. But when we think about chestnuts and how they were utilized, roasted over an open fire, often used on before wild game drives for our Native Americans, it was a good way to sustain and amplify energy on any of those type initiatives, if you will. Another big weed is our lamb's quarters. A lot of people hate this weed. It can get really large, really invasive, spread really quick, but it actually is a great substitute to spinach or kale in any of your recipes. And you'll notice here that this one is a small one. So that's going to be the best time to consume lamb's quarter, because like most of these, again, kind of knowing the timing of harvest is going to lend itself well to you harvesting, because lamb's quarters will get really fibrous. Think about okra. When we leave okra hanging on the plant too long, what happens? It gets woody. It's really tough. A lot of these plants, when they go to seed, are going to do the same thing. They're going to get really tough and really fibrous. So lamb's quarters, when we're picking those greens at this stage, are going to be really nice additions to quiche. Anyway, eggs, anything that we're using spinach in. Chicory, this is one of my personal favorites because it's a caffeine-free substitute for coffee. This is a pretty prevalent plant here in Northeast Tennessee. You see it all along the roadsides. Just a pretty cool plant to get acquainted with. Very tasty. In regards to coffee, you really can't tell the difference other than the caffeine. And then pine, as we get ready to move into the winter months, we need all the vitamin C that we can get, all the immune boosting stimulation that we can get. And pine is one of those that can really do us a huge favor in that regard. A lot of folks don't realize that pine trees can be utilized in this manner, but you kind of see there from the mug, that's how you want to steep it in hot water with a little bit of honey and a little bit of tea. It does have a very astringent, very bold flavor, but it smells like you're drinking a pine tree, but it's just a matter of personal preference and taste. But it is quite tasty and will build the immune system. Just a few more plants to kind of make mention of as we move through the next few slides. Again, a lot of these you're going to recognize, and like I say, you've probably been wildcrafting and didn't even know it. So many species of blueberries and huckleberries exist within the Southern Appalachians. So this is one of those that's going to be prevalent often from June until September, depending on the cultivar. You've already seen this plant here, but ramps, you've probably heard me mention this many times before. Our early settlers really depended on this plant as a early spring green to kind of get everything moving again after a long, hard winter. So this is going to be one of those plants that are pretty sacred to the local folks. You can kind of tell from this little snippet, that colony, it's spreading quite nicely. No offense when I use this terminology, but for the old timers, they really do try to preserve those colonies, and rather than harvesting the entire bulb, they're harvesting the leaves, because you're going to get that same flavor profile minus the bulb. And when you're just cutting one leaf, I don't have a really good picture to show you that, but if you're only harvesting one leaf like here, it is enabling that bulb to continue spreading and for that colony to keep regrowing itself. Many different types of mushrooms. I wanted to throw this one in. This is the chicken of the woods, and many people think that it tastes like chicken, hence the name of this plant. So often used in a wide array of different casseroles, soups, meat dishes, and all that good stuff. And this one is very prevalent in our forest here in southern Appalachia. This is the ostrich fern. This is where we get the true fiddleheads. It's a really great delicacy in early springtime. If you like asparagus, these make wonderful additions. Just harvest those tops and saute those in a little bit of olive oil, and they're very, very tasty. Put this one up here just to, again, reiterate that we've got several species of ferns that are going to do this fiddlehead thing, but they're not going to taste like this one, the ostrich fern. They're going to be a little bit more bitter. They're not going to have that springy asparagus-like flavor. And you're going to think I'm crazy if I tell you to go out and eat these, and then you're like, yeah, that was the worst thing I ever put in my mouth. But that's why it's so critical on this ID, again, is knowing what we are truly harvesting. Many different species of strawberries exist in the wild. This is going to be the alpine strawberry, very tasty, very sweet. Some of you may have, as a child, heard that, oh, don't eat those baby red strawberries growing on the ground, they're poisonous. I had friends of mine in school that their parents told them that for whatever reason. And it's like, no, 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 those are the best strawberries ever. So really good, really tasty. Lots of different things we can do with that. This is sassafras. And of course, all parts of this plant are edible or medicinal in some form or fashion. Of course, the leaves powdered up really fine is what gives us the filet gumbo powder, if you like gumbo. There was a constituent in the roots of this plant that was extracted, saffrole, which is what flavored root beer for many years. It's no longer used in root beer here in the United States. But this is one that we can cook with. We can just use the leaves rather than trying to dig up portions of the root. We can actually use the leaves to add a little bit of flavor, which is going to be very similar to that gumbo zest that we utilize. So very tasty. If you've never had sassafras leaves, it's really good to make it into a tea or just add it to anything. Daylilies. A lot of folks don't realize that these are edible. So this is one that, especially like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, a lot of those leaders will use the daylily for camping exercises and things like that. Lots of different ways to prepare that. There's some links with some recipes to using the daylily, but you can just saute the bloom there and a little bit of olive oil and garlic, and it's a pretty good side dish to have. This is wood sorrel or oxalis. This is one that we see pretty prevalently in the spring into the summer months. This is one that we call a cooling herb. So it's good for a wide range of uses in the body, in the system. It looks a lot like clover, like you can see there. The one thing about wood sorrel, it's really tasty. It's a very good edible herb, but ingesting too much of this, especially if you have kidney problems, can cause an issue. If you're prone to kidney stones, it's got high amounts of oxalic acid, which can be detrimental, of course. So many of these plants, again, it's about the research and kind of knowing how these different plants are going to interact within your own personal body system. For some of you, the oxalates may not cause a big issue, but for others it might. So again, before you start into that wildcrafting, you kind of need to know what each one of these plants are going to be specific to. And high in vitamin C too, by the way. I don't know if any of you have ever noticed this, maybe if you've been out in the woods or hiking or anything, but this is what we call rock tripe, T-R-I-P-E. It's actually been used for hundreds of years as sustenance. It's a lichen. You can probably tell there that's actually growing on a tree. I should have got a picture with a wider angle there, but you can actually just pull that off and eat that, soak that in water, and it becomes really soft, and it looks really gross, but for a simple meal on the trail, it's pretty handy to have that. And if you've never noticed it, I promise you the next time you're out on the trail, you'll see it, because the first time I was introduced to it, I was like, I ain't never seen that stuff before, you know, and then it's like, oh, now I see it everywhere. So it's kind of cool to be walking along and be like, hey, you can eat that nasty looking stuff right there. So beware of the bad berries. We're always told how fabulous berries are, and they're always full of antioxidants. And you've heard me mention the baneberry right there, or what we call the doll's eyes. Any white berry is going to be pretty well toxic. Notice the mulberry. Now we've got different colors of mulberry. We have black, we have red, we have white. The black's usually okay in any form, but if we eat the unripe white or the red, then it can cause a little bit of delirium. So I'm telling y'all bad things. I hope none of you start tripping out on yellow or red mulberries and then be like, well, Melanie told us. But if you eat those in moderation, they usually won't cause a major issue. And of course, if we're cooking those and making jams, anything like that, cooking that out will eradicate that issue. That first one there is the buckeye, and it goes back to proper ID because it looks very similar to a chestnut. And chestnuts we know are really good, but buckeyes are not. They are actually fatal if you consume those in large quantities. So large quantities is going to depend on the size of the person. So buckeyes, just leave those alone. I put a slide in here just with some books that are really handy to have on hand. These are some that I refer to pretty frequently. And then I'll also put in some pictures of some of these others that I use as well. And as I wanted to kind of finish out tonight, just talking about some things that you can actually do from your foraging foray, if you will, some crafty concoctions or cocktails, either way you want to look at that. One of my favorites would be sumac, using the drupes or bobs, which are these little things here, or the berries. You'll hear that called different things. But this is very much edible. So remember back in the days in Europe before lemons were introduced to the Romans, they would utilize sumac to impart that lemony flavor to seafood and a lot of other dishes. And sumac was really high in vitamin C. So that was one of those plants that came from the old world as well, although we have native species here. But this is still used primarily in a lot of Middle Eastern cooking today. So if you travel to that part of the world, more likely than not, at some point you would eat sumac in some form or fashion. But one of the favorites here would be the lemonade. So there's a link to a couple of recipes. It's really cool to try to make this. One word of caution, when you are, I guess, harvesting these drupes, you can't really tell in here, but there's some darker colored. And when you dry those and I guess filter those out, if you don't filter those out, oftentimes your lemonade, it won't be pink. It'll tend to be like a brown color. Sometimes it'll be a yellow color. So if you want that red or pink color, then we want to make sure all of these are going to be uniform in color, which most of the time is pretty easy because every one of these are going to bloom at the same time on each plant. So it's not like they're ripening at different times. So you should be able to achieve that. But just be aware of that. If you do try to make the lemonade and you get this funky color, that's probably why. Another favorite for right now, black walnuts are pretty prevalent. So making a peanut butter or black walnut butter, really easy to do that. So there's a link for a recipe in there. Black walnuts are really high in magnesium, and we hear a lot of that today in the health world, that many of us are deficient or have depleted our magnesium and maybe taken supplements. Black walnuts are a great way to replenish that. And if you're using an oil to make the black walnut butter, coconut oil is a good one to use. Then we have the persimmon pear brandy. And this, of course, we're using pears and persimmons. Word of caution on persimmons, they are ripe right now, but the way that we can tell that they are ripe is if they are on the ground. So if you have access to a wild persimmon, native persimmon tree, you want to, as soon as that persimmon hits the ground, we know that it's going to be sweet and ready to eat. If it's still hanging on the tree, this green portion right here wouldn't be furled very good, and the fruit's still going to be kind of firm. And if you eat it off the tree, you're going to pucker like there is no tomorrow. It'll literally turn your lips inside out. So you know they're ripe when they're falling from the tree. That's the best time to utilize for some of these recipes that I've included in here. But pretty good little concoction to sit around the fireplace. Same thing with persimmon. This is a raw pudding. You don't need to sweeten it a lot if you're picking those when they're ripe. But all that is the tannin ratio in those persimmons that's giving you that pucker. Some people kind of like that pucker. I put this picture of the tree and it didn't take very good, but one way we can tell a persimmon tree is it looks like little squares all down the trunk of that tree. And you can feel those little squares. It's almost like Tetris blocks, or what are those things that kids, Lego blocks. It almost feels like little Lego blocks have been kind of put together down the bark of that tree. Here's one with the conifer and wild berry syrup. You can use any kind of evergreen, pretty much any kind of wild berry. It's going to impart a pretty unique flavor. If you like sauerkraut, this might be one to try. This is a juniper sauerkraut. I know my coworker, Amanda, our FCS agent, is doing a class in a couple of weeks on sauerkraut. And so I'm going to slip this to her and say, you need to tell people to add a little bit of juniper berry, because that's going to give it a little bit of a pine flavor with a little bit of tartness. It just imparts a unique flavor. And then we have the rose hips and cranberries that we can make into a compote like you see here. Very tart, but both of those really high in antioxidant and good for the heart. Just a few more tips before we leave for tonight. Recognize the toxicity of plants. So this is kind of hopefully pulling all this together. This is really, really critical because, again, proper ID. I just did a class in Sullivan County last week on IPM, and I said that repeatedly, identify that pest, know how to treat the pest. But it's the same thing when we're wildcrafting for plants. Know that plant, know if it's toxic or not, know if it's going to be of good use to you or not. Learn the Latin. That's what I mean by name. Oftentimes, and I do this, I'm really bad to do this myself, I will utilize a common name. But as I've discovered, growing up in Western North Carolina, common names are very different than they are here in Northeast Tennessee. And it's going to be different for each and every one of you across the state or even in the region. Those common names are not always going to tell us what's very important. So when we're doing our research, learning that Latin, recognizing the Latin, that's going to help us to be able to identify those plant families a lot better. Really hone your senses. Know that lookalikes abound in nature. So being able to differentiate those is going to be really critical. When I talk about honing your senses, it's just like if, I'm a wine judge in my spare time. So being able to discern certain smells or taste different things from a wine, it kind of allows you to, hone those skills a little bit. And it's the same thing when we're wildcrafting, just really paying attention to the environment for which that plant lives is really going to help you be able to wildcraft ethically. When it comes to harvest, don't over harvest. Native Americans and our early settler ancestors all taught us that you pass by the first 3, 4, 5, 6 plants and leave those for future generations. And that's a practice you'll see a lot of wildcrafters still employ that today. And then when they are harvesting, they only take what they need. That's where collection comes in. Only take what you need, leave more for others. And oftentimes that plant's going to cue you in when it feels like you've had enough anyway. It'll just kind of quit letting go of whatever you're collecting from it too easily. Like if you're picking berries, oftentimes those berries will get harder to pick. So oftentimes Mother Nature will cue you in on that. Know the habitat. Again, you've heard me talk about this several times tonight. When we talk about slope and swamp or something like that, you're not going to find ramps growing in a swampy area, right? And we know that cattails are not going to grow up on a high slope. And speaking of cattails, those are very much edible as well. You can roast the spike of the cattails and eat very similar to how you would corn on the cob. As far as companions, look for nearby clues. So much like poison ivy, we know that it's going to grow very close to jewelweed, because jewelweed is the natural antidote for poison ivy. If you see yellow dock, then more than likely you're going to have pokeweed growing nearby, or vice versa. And I say that about pokeweed because pokeweed, timing is going to be critical. You know, again, that's one of those Appalachian culinary delights, but oftentimes before, I won't say normal folks, but common folk, when they recognize pokeweed, it's too late to be eating pokeweed. So we need to know what pokeweed looks like at a pretty young age to be able to harvest those raw leaves for the poke salad. So oftentimes, again, companions growing nearby are going to kind of clue us in. So if we know, you know, yellow dock, which is pretty common, then more often than not, you're going to have pokeweed growing nearby. Be able to know your seasons. And I've kind of talked about that a little bit. Knowing the best time to harvest is going to be. It's going to vary from plant to plant. Different parts of the plant are going to be able to be harvested at different times of the year. And this can get really extensive. It's like putting a jigsaw puzzle together, kind of like you see here on the screen. So just being able to know that a snake root is going to look like a wood nettle, for instance, but snake root is going to make you sick, whereas wood nettle is going to be edible and is actually going to help replenish, you know, vitamins and minerals in your body. So some of those type things. Again, safety, knowing if all parts are edible and which parts are and which parts aren't. Excuse me. And then keeping a journal. Always take that with you when you're wildcrafting. Not only is that going to help you know kind of where you've harvested from, what you've harvested, what part of that plant. It's also going to help in first aid if you did have a reaction. But also, if you find something this time of year that you're not going to be able to use, but you want to use it next spring, we'll go back to the pokeweed. Everybody knows what pokeweed looks like right now. Of course, the berries are very toxic, but you want to harvest that for poke salad next year, then mark that, write that down in your book, and you'll be able to come back to it next year. Ooh. So just to kind of finish out with a few comments, again, to kind of hopefully bring it full circle, just remembering that all things are connected. This we know, the earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth. And all things are going to be connected like the blood which unites one family. And I think if we kind of keep that in mind, and I left this poem here too, that you can refer back to or click on that, and it'll actually take you to that page. But again, it's all about being ethical in our harvest, really knowing what those plants are, you know, easing into it kind of slowly. It's something that experts have spent years doing, and even some of them will tell you that, you know, they don't always know themselves. So with that, I'm going to finish that up, but I do want to tell you, and I recognize many of you, I think a lot of you are from the Northeast Tennessee area, but one reason I wanted to go ahead and do this class tonight is to kind of just stimulate some of that thinking, get you to maybe think through the winter months, things you would like to wild harvest and maybe do with some of these wild edibles, because my plan is to next spring actually get out into the forest and do some of this hands-on, be able to show you how to identify some of these right from wrong, if you will, and even how to put some of those to use, and even maybe get some of these started in your own landscapes and have access to those all the time. So if you have things that pop into your mind that you think you'd like to learn about or kind of maybe participate in, feel free to shoot me an email, because like I say, that's something I want to be doing maybe next April, actually get out and do some of these woodland walks and see what's out there and put it into practice. So with that, we're going to go ahead and conclude, but we will reconvene on October 25th. And we're going to do Appalachian folklore, kind of superstitions, kind of setting the stage for Halloween, kind of thinking about some of what our ancestors' belief systems were, Native American folklore, granny magic, and all that good stuff. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, make sure you tune in. I think the link is the same for tonight as it, or for the 25th as it was for tonight. So know that in November, we have something going on every Monday on Zoom. So check that out and go ahead and register for that. Registration is open online. I'll send y'all a link tonight or tomorrow, it'll probably be tomorrow, to the Google Drive. I know most of you have access. If this is your first time attending, I'll put the link in there because I've got some additional handouts for you on Wildcrafting in there. And then I'll get this video uplinked as well. So with that, we shall adjourn, and hopefully I will see many of you on the 25th. Thanks, y'all.